what's up weirdos, I'm Felicia and I like scary movies, and today I'm doing a remake versus original video. So this past week I rewatched Let the Right One In, which is one of my favorite vampire movies of all time, and I noticed, I'd never checked out the American remake. And this is mostly because I assumed it would be a disappointment because I love the original so much, but I decided to give it a go, and while I was watching it, I said, I have to make a video. Now, the original Let the Right One In came out in 2008, and it is a Swedish romantic horror film directed by Tomas Alfredson. The movie is based on the novel of the same name by John Lundqvist, who also wrote the screenplay. Now, the American remake came out in 2010, and it was written and directed by Matt Reeves. And horror fans will know him from directing Cloverfield, but he's also directing the new Batman movie. Go Matt. Now, before we jump in, I do want to say this video is going to be full of spoilers, so you have been warned. A little bit of plot for you. Oscar, who is named Owen in the American remake, is a young boy that is mercilessly bullied at school and is full of quiet rage and pain. The adults in his life don't see that he needs help, and he's pretty isolated and lonely until he meets a strange girl named Eli, named Abby in the remake. She helps him find love and revenge, and she's also a vampire. Now first, let's talk about the similarities, and there are quite a lot, so I'm not even really going to go through it. There are times while I was watching this that I was convinced I was looking at a shot-for-shot remake. We have some of the same exact sequences, even some of the same exact lines. At times it was feeling pretty identical, and I was like, what was the point of making this? Both of these movies do take place in the early 1980s. The original takes place in the western Stockholm suburb of Blackburg, and the American one takes place in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Something I really appreciate about the original taking place in Sweden, which, makes sense because it's a Swedish film, but also because in January, Sweden only gets 5 to 6 hours of sunlight per day, which makes it a perfect spot for a vampire. Now, with that being said, story, plot, lines, horror sequences, scares, things like that, all being very similar, let's get into the differences. First off, in the original film, the vampire mythos is much more subtle. It's much more a story about Oscar and Eli's relationship. In an interview I watched, Tomas Alfredson talks about the fact that before this movie, he was mostly a comedy director and didn't really know much about horror, particularly about vampires, so he made his focus of the movie the relationship between Oscar and Eli, and the vampire stuff was just kind of also there. The American version seems to focus a bit more on it being a vampire movie, particularly with the CGI. Chloe Grace Moretz plays Abby in the American version, and she has some pretty hefty CGI on her whenever she's vamping out. And in the original, it's very, very subtle. They would do things like make Eli's eyes maybe 10% bigger or 10% smaller here and there. So it seemed like something was different about her, but you couldn't quite see what it was. Now next I want to compare some of the characters. So Oscar versus Owen. Now they're both very lonely characters. They come from divorced parents. They are both being bullied at school. They're both extremely lonely. In an interview, Alfredson had said he thought that he was the loneliest person in the world until he read this book for the first time. And he thought, Oscar is lonelier than I. And both characters have a sense of anger and rage and violence that builds up in them from being bullied. And many people think that Eli is that violence. She is the mirror of Oscar. They are two halves of a whole person, and she is the violence that is building up inside of him. Something else they have in common is their obsession with serial killers. In Let the Right One In, Oscar has different newspaper clippings that he's cut out of any kind of violence that takes place. They both sort of have these practice sessions of either looking in the mirror or at a tree, threatening it as if they were a serial killer. And it sort of leads us to believe that that's the path they're destined for because of the experiences they're going through. Now, I would say the main difference between these two characters is that Oscar seems to embrace his darkness quite a bit more than Owen does. At one point in the film, he strikes his bully in the ear with a big stick, and Oscar seems to have this slight smile on his face for getting his revenge, for finally hurting the person that hurt him. But Owen in the American remake seems to be afraid of this violence. He's afraid of what he's done. He's scared by it. And this happens again when Oscar watches Eli killed for the first time. Oscar sort of immediately accepts that this is Eli's truth. This is what's gonna happen. This is what's best. And Owen is much more pained by it. There's even a moment of him reaching for the man's hand as though he wants to save him, but then decides not to. And now let's talk about Eli versus Abby. I also never know how to say Ellie, Ellie. It's a little confusing for me, but we're just going with it. So first of all, they're both burdened by their vampirism. They're not thriving in it, as I'll say, but they're sort of burdened in different ways. They are both older vampires. They seem to be a few hundred years old, but they're both emotionally still 12 years old. They're still children, but they just happen to be really old children, if that makes sense. It's not like Interview with the Vampire where Claudia, grows up in a tiny body. These characters are still emotionally young. But I'll say, Eli seems to have accepted her vampirism and her lifestyle a little bit more than Abby has. Abby seems much more saddened by it. She seems very sad the whole movie. And despite what I just said, Abby does feel like a little bit younger than Eli. Eli somehow seems like a little more wise. They did use a voiceover actress for Eli in Let the Right One In for the entirety of the movie. And for Abby, they only ended up using voiceover for when she's really mad or upset, when she kind of vamps out, if you will. And then the rest of the time, she has like a very sweet, girlish, young voice. And I'll say the biggest difference between these characters is that in the original, Eli is much more androgynous. In the book, Eli was born as Elias, and he was taken in by this vampire. He was castrated and then turned into a vampire. And we do get a glimpse of this in the original film where we see Oscar watching Eli change and he sees the scarring. And I'll say it's one of the most shocking moments of the movie that was totally left out of the American remake. And because of this, we end up having sort of two interpretations of some of the lines as well. So in the original, Eli says she's not a girl, and it's sort of ambiguous to what she means by that. But through that glimpse, we're led to believe there's more of a painful and literal meaning behind that. Whereas in the remake, it mostly just seems like when she says, I'm not a girl, what she means is I'm a vampire. And it has nothing to do with gender. Now, moving on from our two leads, there's a little more explanation going on in the American remake, and a lot more in general left to be ambiguous in the original. One of those things is the relationship between Abby and her companion Thomas, named Hawken in the original. But Thomas is her companion who kills all these people throughout the film to make sure that she can eat, so she can drink blood without being caught and destroyed. And in the original, we don't know much about Hawken other than he is totally devoted for her and will do anything for her, including pour acid on his face. But that's kind of it. Like, it seems like maybe he's some sort of father figure, but we don't get too much information. And in the remake, they really explain a lot more. We see this big photo strip, you know what I'm talking about, of Abby and Thomas. And in those photos, Thomas is a 12-year-old boy. And so we get the sense that they have been together since he was 12 and he grew up, and of course she did not. And this almost sort of led me to believe that maybe she has chosen Oscar because she knows she's gonna need a new companion soon because hers is gonna die and she needs someone to get fresh blood for her. But I never really thought that in the original. But I will say, despite saying that, in both movies, both Eli and Oscar are very closed off to each other at the beginning, and they both sort of have to open up to each other over time. So even in the remake, I don't know if it's a manipulative thing or not, but just something to think about. And now the last characters I want to bring up are the bullies. And in both movies, these characters have very similar actions, almost identical lines, but they somehow are still different. In the original, the bullies feel a little more complicated. We have one bully who starts crying while he's hitting Oscar because he feels so scared and upset by it. And at the end, Eli even lets that boy live, maybe because of this. And we have another character who seems to almost sneak Oscar nice glances or little moments where you can tell that he feels bad for what's happening or going to happen to Oscar. And then in the remake, the bullies just seem more stereotypical stock characters. And I'll say maybe a bit more boring. And the last comparison I want to make is the score, which I think overall influences the differences in tone in this movie. I'm probably going to butcher this name, but the Swedish composer Johan Söderqvist wrote the score for the original, and it's this like kind of sweeping romantic score that it's just like totally beautiful, and I think helps this movie focus on the relationship versus the scares. Whereas the American score by Michael Giacchino feels much more like a traditional horror soundtrack that is supposed to help with the scares of the movie. And I guess the last thing I'll say, So the pool scene, and if you've seen this movie, of course you know what I mean, the pool scene at the end of the film is one of my favorite horror sequences of all time. I've seen it a million times, just that scene, because I'm so amazed by it. And I will say that the remake did a good job with that scene, like it felt very similar. But the one key difference for me is that Eli let one of the bullies live, the one that kind of had a soul or a heart, I will say, and Abby did not. And so I think letting one of the boys live kind of added to Eli's character of her having an understanding of good and evil in a more complicated way than maybe Abby does. And then I think the ending scene for both movies, they're identical. It's Oscar on a train with Eli in a box and they're off to live their life together. And I love that scene, and I think it works well in both movies. And I think that's it. Did I cover everything I wanted to? I was very stressed about making this video for some reason. I think it's because I love Let the Right One In so much. I just wanted to do it justice and make a good video about it. Overall, I do definitely prefer the original film. I think it is just more beautiful. The score, I think it's more brutal. I think it has more heart. It seems more genuine to me. Everything about it is just, I think it's a perfect movie. And the remake, though I think successful in certain ways, doesn't fully seem necessary to me. And I will say I did see an interview with Tomas Alfredson where he said that when they approached him about making an American remake, he was kind of like, why would I make the same film again? Why don't American audiences just watch my movie? And I'm like, yes, I know. But I do think we're in a great time where more and more horror films are being taken in by American audiences just as they are without the idea of making an American version of them. And I think that's very exciting. So hopefully we can stay on that path, people. There's nothing wrong with a little subtitle. But I think that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching. Let me know if you have any other thoughts about these movies down in the comments down below. And I think that's it. Have a nice screen, people. Bye.